Ghost? Did someone just say ghost? Jake's voice crackled through the intercom as the entire cabin fell silent, every eye turning to the woman in seat 8A, who had just shattered 3 years of carefully hidden identity. Welcome back, beautiful souls. If you're already hooked, smash that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story will be just as powerful and you won't want to miss it. Now let me tell you how a war hero's secret changed everything at 35,000 feet. Isabella Chen adjusted her worn baseball cap for the 3rd time, pulling the brim lower as passengers shuffled past her window seat. The faded Navy logo had seen better days, much like everything else in her life. Her fingers traced the edge of her boarding pass, 8A just another face in the crowd, exactly how she preferred it. The hum of the aircraft's engines should have been comforting. Once, that sound had meant home, purpose, the rush of adrenaline before a mission. Now it just reminded her of everything she'd lost. The empty seat beside her felt like a blessing. She'd grown allergic to small talk, to the inevitable questions about what she did for work. Used to do, she corrected herself silently. Through the small window, she watched ground crew loading luggage with practiced efficiency. Their choreographed movements reminded her of her old squadron, everyone knowing their role, trusting each other completely. She blinked hard, forcing away the memory of Captain Rodriguez's laugh echoing through the hangar, or Lieutenant Murphy's terrible jokes during pre-flight briefings. 3 years since the mission that changed everything. 3 years since she'd been in a cockpit. 3 years since she'd been anything more than a ghost haunting her own life. Her phone buzzed, another text from her sister. Still coming to visit? The kids miss their Aunt Izzy. Isabella almost smiled. Her nephews didn't know Aunt Izzy had once been Ghost, the pilot whose tactical genius had saved 200 Marines from certain death in hostile territory. They just knew she brought good presents and made the best paper airplanes. "Excuse me, ma'am," a flight attendant's voice interrupted her thoughts. "We're just waiting for our flight crew to finish their final checks." Isabella nodded, grateful for the distraction. The attendant moved on, and she returned to her preferred activity, being invisible. But invisibility was a fragile thing. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Commander Jake Torres ran through his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 tours and counting. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Kim, was reviewing weather patterns while he tested the communication system. "Tower, this is Navy Flight 847 requesting final clearance for takeoff." Jake spoke into his headset. "Navy Flight 847, you are cleared for takeoff. Safe travels, Ghost Squadron." Jake's hand froze on the throttle. Ghost Squadron. The call sign that had been retired 3 years ago after... "Sir?" Lieutenant Kim noticed his pause. "Everything all right?" "Yeah." Jake cleared his throat. "Just thought I heard something." But he hadn't imagined it. The tower operator had used the old squadron designation, the one that belonged to the most legendary pilot in recent Navy history. Lieutenant Commander Isabella Chen, call sign Ghost. Jake had been a junior officer when news of her final mission spread through every naval air station. The woman who'd flown into hell itself to extract Marines from an impossible situation, who'd outmaneuvered enemy fighters while her own squadron burned around her, who'd saved 200 lives and lost her entire team doing it. She'd disappeared after that. Honorable discharge, full military honors, and then nothing. Like she'd become her call sign in the most literal sense. "Tower, can you confirm that call sign designation?" Jake asked, his curiosity getting the better of his professionalism. A pause. "Apologies. Navy Flight 847. Old habits. You're cleared for standard departure." But Jake's mind was racing. Ghost Squadron had been Sarah Kim's squadron, but she'd been on medical leave during that final mission, which meant, "Kim," he said carefully, Weren't you part of Ghost Squadron? Her face went pale. Yes, sir, before I was reassigned. Why? Just wondering if you ever met her. The pilot everyone talks about. Lieutenant Kim's knuckles went white as she gripped her controls. Once, sir, she was the best of us. Lost everything saving those Marines. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. I heard she never flew again. Jake nodded, filing the information away. Every pilot in the Navy knew the story, but few knew the woman behind it. She'd become more legend than person, a cautionary tale about the cost of heroism. As he guided the aircraft down the taxiway, Jake found himself wondering what happened to heroes when the war was over. Where did legends go to hide? He was about to find out. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, climbing toward cruising altitude. In the passenger cabin, Isabella felt the familiar sensation of takeoff, that moment when gravity released its hold and possibility opened up before you. Once, that feeling had made her heart soar. Now, it just made her remember what she'd lost. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, unaware that her past was about to collide with her present at 35,000 feet. What do you think happens when a war hero tries to disappear? Have you ever had a moment where your past caught up with you unexpectedly? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes the very thing we're running from might be exactly what we need to face. The turbulence hit without warning. Isabella's eyes snapped open as the aircraft lurched violently to the left. Her trained instincts kicked in before her conscious mind caught up. She was already bracing against the seat, reading the aircraft's movements like a language she'd never forgotten. Around her, passengers gasped and clutched armrests. A woman across the aisle whispered prayers in Spanish. But Isabella felt something else entirely, the subtle wrongness in the engine's rhythm, the way the aircraft was fighting the pilot's corrections. This wasn't normal turbulence. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Jake's voice came through the intercom, steady but strained. We're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened while we work through this. Isabella's pulse quickened. She knew that tone, calm professionalism, masking genuine concern. She'd used it herself, talking to base control while enemy fighters closed in and her fuel gauge dropped toward empty. The aircraft shuddered again, harder this time. Someone behind her was crying softly. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with forced smiles, their training keeping panic at bay, but Isabella could see the fear in their eyes. In the cockpit, she knew Jake and his co-pilot were running through emergency procedures, troubleshooting systems, calculating alternatives. She could almost see their hands moving across familiar controls, the same dance she'd performed 100 times in crisis situations. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, muscle memory reaching for controls that weren't there. "Ma'am?" The flight attendant who'd spoken to her earlier appeared at her elbow, voice carefully controlled. "Are you all right? You look—" "I'm fine," Isabella said quickly, but her eyes were fixed on the cabin ceiling, tracking the aircraft's movements through her body. Bank left, altitude dropping. Engines cycling through what sounded like a restart sequence. The intercom crackled again. This time, it was a different voice. Lieutenant Kim, she realized. "Captain, we have a problem." Kim's voice carried through some kind of communication error, broadcasting to the entire cabin. "Hydraulic failure in the primary system. Backups responding, but we're looking at a challenging approach." Isabella closed her eyes. Hydraulic failure. She'd dealt with that before. Over the desert, with surface-to-air missiles tracking her and her wingmen already down. You could fly without hydraulics, but landing was another story entirely. "Copy that," Jake's voice responded, still broadcasting to the cabin by mistake. "How much time do we have?" "Maybe 30 minutes before we lose backup systems entirely. We need to get her on the ground." The passengers around Isabella were beginning to understand. Hushed conversations turned to worried whispers, then to the kind of silence that precedes panic. But Isabella wasn't listening to them anymore. She was listening to the engines, feeling the aircraft's subtle communications through her seat, reading the situation like a book written in a language only pilots understood. They were in trouble, real trouble. And sitting here, helpless, was killing her. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "Ma'am, please," the flight attendant started. "I need to speak to your captain," Isabella said, standing despite the aircraft's erratic movements. "I'm sorry, but passengers aren't allowed. My name is Lieutenant Commander Isabella Chen." The words came out before she could stop them, breaking the silence she'd maintained for 3 years. "Call sign Ghost, and your pilots are about to attempt an emergency landing they might not survive without help." The flight attendant's face went white. Around them, several passengers had heard. An older man in a military uniform, 2 rows back, straightened in recognition. A woman with Air Force insignia on her bag turned to stare. But it was the voice that came over the intercom next that changed everything. "Ghost?" It was Jake's voice, broadcasting again through the malfunctioning system. Did someone just say ghost? The entire cabin fell silent. "Sir," came Lieutenant Kim's shaky voice over the comm, "Ghost was Isabella Chen. She was killed 3 years ago, wasn't she?" The mission report said a lot of things. Jake's voice cut through the static. But Isabella Chen wasn't killed. She just disappeared. Isabella felt every eye in the cabin turn to her. The weight of recognition, of a legend stepping out of hiding, pressed down on her shoulders like the G-forces she'd once thrived on. "Captain," she called out, her voice carrying with the authority she'd never quite lost. "This is Lieutenant Commander Chen. I'm in seat 8A, and I'd like to offer my assistance." The silence stretched for an eternity. Then Jake's voice, barely controlled, "Ghost, is it really you?" Isabella looked around the cabin at the faces watching her, some afraid, some awed, some simply trying to understand how their quiet seatmate had suddenly become someone else entirely. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's me, and right now we have bigger problems than my identity." Another violent shudder ran through the aircraft. Oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, dangling like yellow flowers in a sudden spring rain. "Ghost," Jake's voice came through the intercom, and she could hear both the relief and the weight of command in it. "We could really use your help up here." Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: purpose. The familiar surge of adrenaline that came not from fear, but from having a job to do, a crew to save, a mission that mattered. She looked at the flight attendant, whose wide eyes reflected both terror and hope. "Ma'am," the woman whispered, "are you really her? The pilot they call the miracle worker?" Isabella's jaw tightened. Miracle worker. If only they knew how many people she'd failed to save while performing her so-called miracles. "I'm just a pilot," she said quietly. "But right now, that might be enough." As she moved toward the cockpit, she heard whispers following in her wake. Passengers reaching for phones to text loved ones, voices murmuring her name like a prayer, like a talisman against disaster. "Ghost! Ghost! The ghost!" Behind her, in seat 8A, her baseball cap lay forgotten on the seat. The woman who had boarded the plane as nobody special was walking toward the cockpit as one of the most celebrated pilots in naval history. And for the first time in 3 years, Isabella Chen felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The cockpit door stood ahead of her, and beyond it, 2 pilots who needed her help, 2 pilots who had no idea that their legendary ghost was about to step back into the world she'd tried so desperately to leave behind. Isabella stood frozen outside the cockpit door, her hand hovering inches from the handle. the weight of 3 years of carefully constructed invisibility pressed against her chest like a physical force. "Just walk away," a voice in her head whispered. "Let them handle it. You're not responsible for every crisis in the sky." Behind the door, she could hear the rapid-fire communication between Jake and Lieutenant Kim, their voices tight with concentration and barely controlled stress. Systems checks, altitude adjustments, fuel calculations, the language of emergency aviation that once flowed through her veins like blood. "Ghost?" Jake's voice called through the intercom, broadcasting to the entire cabin. "Are you coming up?" The passengers were watching her. She could feel their eyes boring into her back, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of expectation and fear. Someone behind her was quietly crying. A child was asking his mother what was happening. Isabella's throat constricted. This was exactly what she'd spent 3 years avoiding, being responsible for other people's lives, carrying the weight of their hopes and fears. The last time she'd been in a cockpit during a crisis, 6 good pilots had died under her command. She started, then stopped. Her voice caught in her throat. Rodriguez laughing at her terrible jokes. Murphy showing her pictures of his newborn daughter. Williams promising to buy the whole squadron drinks when they got back to base. None of them had made it back. "Ma'am," the flight attendant was beside her, voice gentle but urgent. "They're waiting for you." Isabella shook her head slowly. "I can't. I haven't flown in 3 years. I'm not current on procedures. I don't know these systems." It wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. Pilots like Isabella didn't forget how to fly any more than pianists forgot how to play. The skills were buried under layers of grief and guilt, but they were still there. "But your Ghost," an older man's voice came from behind her. She turned to see the passenger with military insignia, his face grave but respectful. "My son was one of those Marines you saved. He made it home because of you." Isabella felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "I didn't save anyone," she said quietly. "I got lucky. Other people died so those Marines could live." "That's not," the man started. "That's exactly what happened." Isabella cut him off, her voice sharper than she intended. She was beginning to attract attention from other passengers now, their conversations stopping as they strained to listen. The aircraft lurched again, more violently this time. The overhead bins rattled, and someone screamed. Through the cockpit door, she heard Jake curse under his breath. "Systems are degrading faster than expected," Lieutenant Kim's voice crackled over the intercom. "We need to start our approach now, or we're not going to have any control surfaces left." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Every instinct she'd developed over years of military service was screaming at her to act, to take control, to find a solution. But louder than those instincts was the memory of fire and smoke, of radio calls that would never be answered, of families she'd had to face at funerals while wearing dress blues and a chest full of medals she didn't deserve. "Ghost." Jake's voice came through the door. Quieter now, meant just for her. "I know you're out there. I know this is hard. But we've got 147 people on this plane, and we could really use the best pilot in the Navy right about now." "I'm not the best pilot in the Navy," Isabella said, her forehead pressed against the cool metal of the cockpit door. "I'm not even a pilot anymore." "The hell you're not," came a new voice. Lieutenant Kim, her words carrying clearly through the intercom malfunction. "I was in Ghost Squadron before the reassignment. I know what you did for those Marines. I know what it cost you. But running away doesn't change who you are." Isabella's hands clenched into fists. Kim had been there. She'd seen the aftermath, the investigation, the way command had tried to turn a disaster into a victory for the press. She'd seen Isabella break down in the debriefing room, refusing the Medal of Honor they wanted to pin on her chest. "Kim," Isabella called out, loud enough to be heard through the door, "You know what happened. You know why I can't. I know you saved 200 Marines while your squadron burned around you," Kim interrupted, her voice fierce despite their desperate situation. "I know you flew a damaged aircraft through enemy fire for 6 hours. I know you landed with 17 bullet holes in your fuselage and no hydraulics. And I know 6 pilots died because I made the wrong call." Isabella's voice cracked, the words torn from somewhere deep inside her chest. The entire cabin went silent, except for the labored sound of the engines and her own ragged breathing. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then Jake's voice, gentle but firm, "Ghost, I don't know what happened on that mission. But I know what's happening right now. We've got backup hydraulics failing, limited fuel, and a runway we might not be able to reach. I've got 8 years of experience, and Lieutenant Kim's got 5. Between us, we're good pilots, but we're not miracle workers." He paused, and Isabella could hear the weight in his voice when he continued, "You are." Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Miracle workers don't get their entire squadron killed." "No," said a quiet voice behind her. She turned to see a young woman holding a toddler, both of them watching her with wide eyes. "But they get other people home safe. That's what you did for my husband. He was one of those Marines. He talks about ghosts sometimes, says she was the angel who brought him back to us." The toddler looked at Isabella with curious eyes, too young to understand the crisis, but old enough to sense the tension. "Airplane go down?" he asked solemnly. Isabella felt something crack inside her chest. This child, this family, these passengers, they weren't her responsibility. She hadn't asked for this. She just wanted to fly commercially, to see her nephews, to be anonymous and safe and free from the weight of other people's lives. But responsibility wasn't something you chose. It was something that chose you. The aircraft shuddered again, and this time the lights flickered. Someone screamed. The child in the woman's arms began to cry. "Ghost!" Jake's voice came one more time, stripped of everything but desperate honesty. "I don't care what happened 3 years ago. Right now, in this moment, you're the only person on this plane who might know how to get us on the ground alive. So I'm asking, not as a commanding officer, not as a fellow pilot, but as someone who's scared as hell, will you please help us?" Isabella looked around the cabin one more time, at the faces watching her with hope and fear, at the child who'd stopped crying and was now staring at her with the absolute trust that only children possess, at the man whose son she'd helped save, and the woman whose husband had come home because of a mission that had destroyed everything Isabella thought she knew about herself. She took a deep breath, tasting the recycled air and the sharp edge of her own terror. Then she reached for the cockpit door handle. "I'm not current," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm not qualified on this aircraft type, and I haven't been in a cockpit since you saved 200 lives," Jake finished for her. Isabella's hand tightened on the handle. "Since I got 6 good pilots killed, maybe," Jake said quietly. "But today you might save 147 passengers. That's got to count for something." Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her like the harness of a fighter jet. Heavy, constraining, but somehow right. When she opened them again, she was no longer the woman who'd boarded in seat 8A. She was Ghost. And for the first time in 3 years, that didn't feel like a burden. It felt like coming home. Isabella pushed through the cockpit door and stepped into a world she'd tried to forget. The familiar symphony of aviation hit her immediately, the soft hum of electronics, the whisper of air conditioning, the subtle vibrations of an aircraft fighting to stay aloft. Her eyes swept across the instrument panel with the automatic precision of muscle memory, reading dozens of indicators in seconds. Jake Torres looked up from his controls, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. She'd expected to see doubt in his eyes, or the kind of hero worship she'd grown to hate. Instead, she saw something else entirely, relief mixed with genuine fear, the look of a professional pilot who knew he was in over his head. "Ghost," he said simply. Then caught himself. "Isabella." "Save it," she interrupted, settling into the jump seat behind them. "What's our situation?" Lieutenant Kim turned from the co-pilot's position, her face pale but focused. "Primary hydraulics failed completely 20 minutes ago. Backup system is operating at 30% and dropping. We've lost most of our control surface authority." Isabella's eyes moved across the displays, her pilot's brain automatically translating the red warning lights into tactical information. 40 minutes at current consumption, Jake replied. "But we're burning more trying to maintain control." "Nearest suitable runway?" "Portland International," but Jake's jaw tightened. "At our current rate of descent and the control issues, I'm not sure we can make the approach pattern." Isabella studied the navigation display, calculating distances and descent rates with the kind of split-second analysis that had once made her legendary. The numbers weren't good. "What about Hillsborough?" she asked, naming a smaller airport she remembered from her training days. "Shorter runway, no emergency equipment," Kim said. "We'll come in controlled," Isabella said firmly. "Jake, give me the controls for a second." Jake hesitated. Technically, Isabella had no authority here. She wasn't current, wasn't qualified on this aircraft, wasn't even officially a pilot anymore. But the way she'd said it, the quiet confidence in her voice, made him move his hands away from the controls without thinking. Isabella took the stick, and immediately the aircraft's erratic movements smoothed out. Her touch was gentle but precise, working with the damaged systems instead of fighting them. Within seconds, she'd stabilized their altitude and corrected their drift. "How did you?" Kim started. "Hydraulic failures are like flying a sick horse," Isabella said, her hands never stopping their minute adjustments. "You don't pull harder on the reins. You learn to feel what the horse can give you." Jake watched her work with something approaching awe. He'd been struggling with the controls for 30 minutes, fighting the aircraft's tendency to roll left and nose down. Isabella had corrected both issues with adjustments so subtle he could barely see them. "You want to explain how you did that?" he asked. Isabella's hands stilled for a microsecond, so briefly that only another pilot would have noticed. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral, experience. But Jake caught the shadow that passed across her face, the way her jaw tightened at the word. There was a story there, written in the controlled precision of her movements and the careful distance in her voice. "Isabella," Kim said quietly, "the passengers are asking questions. Word's getting out that you're up here. Some of them they're calling you a hero." Isabella's grip on the controls tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm not." The simple statement hung in the cockpit, like smoke. Jake found himself studying her profile, the sharp focus of her eyes, the way she held herself with military precision despite the casual clothes. This wasn't the confident war hero from the stories he'd heard. This was someone carrying a weight he couldn't quite understand. "The mission report said," he began. "The mission report said what they needed to say." Isabella cut him off, her voice sharp enough to end the conversation. But Jake had spent enough time around damaged pilots to recognize the signs. The way she avoided eye contact when anyone mentioned her service record. The careful control she maintained over every word, every gesture. The fact that she'd disappeared completely after her most celebrated mission. "We need to talk approach strategy," Isabella said, clearly changing the subject. "Hillsborough's runway alignment favors a southeast approach, but with our control limitations—" "Isabella," Jake interrupted gently, "you don't have to prove anything to us." She turned to look at him then, and for just a moment he saw past the legendary ghost to the woman underneath, tired, haunted, running from something that had nothing to do with enemy fighters or surface-to-air missiles. "Yes, I do," she said quietly. The aircraft shuddered again, reminding them all that they were still in crisis. Isabella immediately returned her attention to the controls, making corrections with the same smooth precision. "Okay," Jake said, settling back into his role as aircraft commander while letting Isabella handle the flying. "Walk us through your thinking." For the next several minutes, they worked together with the kind of seamless coordination that usually took months to develop. Isabella's tactical brilliance combined with Jake's knowledge of the aircraft systems and Kim's expertise with emergency procedures. Despite the circumstances, Jake found himself impressed not just by Isabella's flying skills, but by the way she integrated into their crew. She didn't take over or demand authority. Instead, she worked within their existing dynamic, offering suggestions and expertise while respecting the chain of command. It was the mark of someone who'd led teams through genuine crises, who understood that ego was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Contact Portland approach," Isabella suggested. "Tell them we're declaring an emergency and requesting vectors to Hillsborough. They'll want to know our souls on board and fuel remaining." Jake nodded, reaching for the radio. "Portland approach, this is Navy Flight 847 declaring emergency. We have total hydraulic failure and are requesting immediate vectors to Hillsborough Airport." "Navy 847, Portland approach. Copy your emergency. Say souls on board and fuel remaining." 147 souls, fuel for approximately 30 minutes. Copy. Hillsborough emergency equipment is being notified. Be advised, you have been cleared for priority handling. Descend and maintain 4000. Heading 180 for Hillsborough approach. Isabella was already turning the aircraft before Jake acknowledged the instruction, her movements so smooth that the passengers probably didn't even feel the course change. "You've done this before," Jake observed. "More times than I care to remember," Isabella replied, but there was something in her voice, not pride, but a kind of weary acceptance. "The stories about the Marine extraction," Kim said carefully. "Were they true? Did you really fly 6 hours through enemy territory with a damaged aircraft?" Isabella's hands never stopped their gentle corrections on the controls, but Jake saw her shoulders tense. 6 hours, 17 minutes, she said finally. But it wasn't heroic, it was just necessary. Jake found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn by something in her voice. The question hung in the air for a long moment. Outside the cockpit windows, the Oregon landscape rolled by below them, peaceful and green and utterly disconnected from the drama playing out at altitude. They followed orders, Isabella said at last, her voice so quiet Jake had to strain to hear her. And suddenly, Jake understood. The careful emotional control. The way she'd disappeared after her moment of glory. The reason a pilot of her caliber had walked away from flying entirely. Survivor's guilt. "Isabella," he started. "We're at 4000, she interrupted, her professional mask firmly back in place. "Time to start configuring for approach." But as they began their descent toward Hillsborough, Jake couldn't shake the image of what Isabella must have gone through, flying home alone while her squadron burned behind her, carrying the weight of their sacrifice along with the lives of the Marines she'd saved. No wonder she'd tried to disappear. No wonder she'd chosen Seat 8A, anonymous and invisible, hoping never to face a cockpit again. And no wonder she was fighting so hard now to save the lives of strangers, because maybe if she could bring this aircraft and its passengers safely home, it might somehow balance the scales of all the people she couldn't save. Jake glanced at her profile as she worked and realized he was looking at someone far more complex than any legend. Someone whose greatest victory had also been her greatest loss. Someone who, despite everything, was still fighting to bring people home safe. Hillsborough Tower, Navy 847 on final approach. Emergency aircraft, total hydraulic failure. Navy 847, Hillsborough Tower. Runway is clear. Emergency equipment standing by. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. You are cleared to land. Isabella's hands moved across the controls with mechanical precision, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her breathing had become more controlled. They were 5 minutes from touchdown, and the hardest part was still ahead. "Flaps?" Jake asked. "Negative. We'll come in clean and fast. Less stress on the backup systems." Isabella's voice was steady, but Jake caught the micropause before she continued. "I've done this approach before. Different aircraft, different crisis, but—" She didn't finish the thought, but Kim leaned forward from her position. "The marine extraction? Is that what you're thinking about?" Isabella's jaw tightened. For a moment, Jake thought she wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly he had to strain to hear over the engine noise. Al Anbar Province. March 15th, 3 years ago. The date meant nothing to Jake, but he could see from Kim's expression that it meant everything to her. "That was Ghost Squadron's final mission," Kim whispered. Isabella nodded, never taking her eyes off the instruments. 200 Marines trapped in a compound. Intel said we had a 4-hour window before enemy reinforcements arrived. Should have been a routine extraction. Her hands made minute adjustments to their approach angle, compensating for the sluggish controls. Jake found himself holding his breath, not just because of their current crisis, but because he could feel the weight of memory filling the cockpit. "What went wrong?" he asked gently. Isabella was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wouldn't answer. "Then I went wrong." The runway was visible now, a thin strip of asphalt growing larger through the windscreen. Emergency vehicles lined both sides, their red and blue lights painting the approaching dusk in urgent colors. The compound was more heavily defended than Intel suggested, Isabella continued, her voice taking on the flat, factual tone of a mission debrief. "We took heavy fire on the first pass. Rodriguez's bird was hit, losing hydraulics. Murphy had engine trouble. Williams was dealing with electrical failures." Jake watched her face as she spoke. She was reliving it, he realized, not just remembering but actually experiencing it again through the filter of their current emergency. Standard protocol would have been to abort, wait for air support, come back with overwhelming force. Isabella's voice caught almost imperceptibly, but those Marines had been pinned down for 18 hours. They were running out of ammunition, out of time. "So you made the call to continue," Jake said. "It wasn't a question." "I made the call." Isabella's hands tightened on the controls. "One more pass," I told them. "Quick and dirty. Get the Marines and get out." The runway was rushing toward them now, but Jake found himself completely absorbed in Isabella's story. This wasn't the sanitized version from the mission reports or the heroic narrative that had made her a legend. This was the raw, painful truth of what had actually happened. Rodriguez went in first. Isabella continued, "His hydraulics were failing, but he was the best pilot I'd ever served with. Steady hands, good judgment. He could have made it work." She paused, adjusting their descent rate with movements so subtle Jake could barely detect them. "But I was flight leader. I was supposed to be watching the big picture, monitoring threats, coordinating the extraction. Instead, I was focused on the Marines on the ground. I saw a SAM battery rotate toward Rodriguez's position, and Isabella's voice trailed off. In the silence, Jake could hear his own heartbeat, the whisper of air over the wings, the distant sound of sirens from the emergency vehicles below. "I broke formation," Isabella whispered. "Left my position to take out the SAM site. For maybe 90 seconds, I wasn't where I was supposed to be." Jake's chest tightened. He could see where this was going. In those 90 seconds, 3 more SAM batteries came online from positions we hadn't mapped. Rodriguez took a direct hit. Murphy flew right into a missile, trying to cover the extraction. Williams, Isabella's voice broke slightly. Williams called out threats I couldn't see because I was out of position. The runway was filling their windscreen now. Isabella began the delicate process of bringing the damaged aircraft down, working with failing systems and limited control authority. "But you got the Marines out," Kim said. "The report said you saved all 200. "I got them out," Isabella confirmed, her voice hollow. "Flew 6 hours on backup systems, with half my instruments dark and bullet holes in my fuselage. Made 3 emergency landings to refuel and patch what I could. Brought those Marines home to their families." She pulled back gently on the controls, flaring for landing. The aircraft touched down hard but controlled, and Jake felt the rumble of tires on asphalt. "And your squadron?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "Never made it out. 6 pilots. Rodriguez had 3 kids. Murphy's wife was pregnant with their first. Williams was 2 months from retirement." Isabella's voice was barely audible over the sound of reverse thrust and braking systems. "They died because their flight leader made the wrong choice." The aircraft rolled to a stop, and for a moment the cockpit was filled with the relative quiet of engines winding down and systems shutting off. Through the windows, Jake could see emergency personnel surrounding the plane, but he couldn't bring himself to move. "Isabella," he said finally, "you saved 200 lives." "I killed 6 good pilots," she replied, beginning her shutdown checklist with mechanical precision. "Command called it heroic. Pinned medals on my chest, put my picture in every military publication in the country. But I know the truth." Jake watched her work, seeing now the real reason she'd walked away from flying. It wasn't survivor's guilt. It was command guilt, the crushing weight of being responsible for decisions that saved some lives and cost others. "The hardest part," Isabella said, pulling off her headset, "wasn't the 6 hours of flying damaged. It wasn't the enemy fire or the system failures. It was landing back at base and having to look at the empty spaces where my wingmen should have been." She turned to face Jake directly for the first time since entering the cockpit. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady. "So when people call me a hero, when they talk about the miracle of that mission, I want to tell them that heroes don't come home alone. Heroes don't have to choose which lives to save and which to sacrifice. Heroes don't lie awake at night wondering if they made the right call." Jake found himself leaning forward, drawn by the raw honesty in her voice. "But you did make the right call. You saved." "Did I?" Isabella interrupted. "Rodriguez had a 4-year-old daughter who asks her mother when Daddy's coming home. Murphy's son will never meet his father. Williams was going to buy a boat and sail around the world with his wife. Were those Marines' lives worth more than my pilots' lives?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Jake realized he was looking at someone who had been carrying this weight alone for 3 years, someone who had disappeared not because she couldn't handle the fame, but because she couldn't handle the cost of her success. "I don't know," Jake said honestly. "I don't know how anyone makes that choice." Isabella nodded, seeming to appreciate his honesty more than false comfort. "Neither do I, but I made it anyway, and I've been living with it ever since." Through the cockpit windows, Jake could see passengers beginning to evacuate through the emergency slides, all 147 souls on board, safe on the ground because of Isabella's skill and Jake's steady hands and Kim's professional competence. But Jake found himself thinking not about the lives they'd saved today, but about the impossible choices that sometimes came with saving lives. About the weight that leaders carried when split-second decisions meant the difference between tragedy and triumph. About the woman sitting beside him, who had chosen to bear that weight alone rather than accept praise she felt she didn't deserve. "Isabella," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, I think you're the bravest person I've ever met." She looked at him with surprise. "Brave? You could have stayed in seat 8AA. Could have let us handle this crisis on our own. Instead, you walked back into the thing that hurt you most because people needed help." Jake met her eyes. "That's not the action of someone running from responsibility. That's the action of someone who understands it better than most." For the first time since entering the cockpit, Isabella's carefully controlled mask slipped. Jake saw exhaustion there, and pain, but also something else. A flicker of recognition, as if he'd said something she'd been waiting 3 years to hear. Have you ever had to make an impossible choice where there was no right answer? Sometimes the heaviest burden isn't failure, it's success that comes at a cost. What do you think? Can someone be both a hero and carry the weight of loss at the same time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Outside, emergency personnel were helping passengers down the slides, families reuniting on the tarmac, lives continuing because of decisions made in crisis. Inside the cockpit, 2 pilots sat in the growing dusk, beginning to understand that sometimes the most important connections happen not in moments of triumph, but in moments of shared recognition of what it means to carry the weight of other people's lives. The Airport Operations Center was buzzing with activity. FAA investigators, airline officials, emergency coordinators, all moving with the controlled urgency that followed any aviation incident. Isabella sat in a corner chair watching the choreographed chaos and feeling like a spectator to her own life. She'd given her preliminary statement to the investigators, answered their technical questions about the emergency procedures, and accepted their thanks with the kind of polite detachment she'd perfected over 3 years of avoiding attention. Now she just wanted to disappear back to her anonymous life. "Mind if I sit?" Isabella looked up to find Jake holding 2 cups of coffee, his uniform slightly rumpled, his hair showing the effects of wearing a headset for hours. He looked tired but somehow more relaxed than he'd been in the cockpit. "It's a free country," she said, then immediately regretted the sharpness in her voice. He'd done nothing but help, and she was treating him like an intrusion. Jake settled into the chair beside her, offering one of the cups. "Fair warning, it's airport coffee. I think they made it sometime last week." Despite herself, Isabella almost smiled. "I've had worse. Military coffee could strip paint. You remember that fondly, do you?" Isabella wrapped her hands around the warm cup, using the heat to ground herself. Some things about the service were good. The coffee wasn't one of them. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the controlled chaos around them. Isabella found herself stealing glances at Jake, trying to reconcile the steady professional she'd worked with in the cockpit with this quieter, more thoughtful version. "Can I ask you something?" Jake said finally. Isabella tensed automatically. 3 years of avoiding personal questions had made her wary of anything that started that way. "Depends what it is." "Why did you really come forward? In the cabin, I mean. You could have stayed in your seat. Let us handle it ourselves." Isabella stared into her coffee, watching steam curl up from the dark surface. It was a question she'd been avoiding asking herself. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe because I heard Kim's voice and remembered what it was like to be in over your head with lives depending on you. Kim told me you 2 served together before her reassignment. Different squadrons, same base. She was always good, steady hands, good tactical sense. She'll make a fine commander someday." Isabella paused. If today didn't scare her away from flying. Jake studied her profile. "Is that what happened to you? One bad day scared you away?" Isabella's grip tightened on her coffee cup. "It wasn't a bad day. It was a day when I had to choose who lived and who died, and then spend the rest of my life wondering if I chose right." You keep saying that like there was a right choice, Jake said gently. But maybe there wasn't. Maybe there was just the choice you made, and you've been punishing yourself for making it. Isabella turned to look at him directly. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Jake's voice remained calm, but there was something in his eyes, understanding, maybe, or recognition. You want to know why I really became a transport pilot instead of staying in fighters? Isabella blinked, caught off guard by the shift in conversation. 2 years ago, I was leading a training exercise. Routine stuff, formation flying, basic maneuvers. I had a nugget pilot, fresh out of flight school, eager to prove himself. Kid named Danny Reeves. Jake's voice took on the same flat, factual tone Isabella had used when describing her mission. She recognized it immediately, the voice someone used when recounting the worst day of their life. Danny was good, but he was pushing too hard, trying to keep up with more experienced pilots. I should have pulled him back, told him to ease off. Jake stared at his hands. Instead, I let him stay in formation because I remembered being young and eager, and I didn't want to crush his confidence. Isabella felt something cold settle in her stomach. What happened? Mechanical failure at low altitude, should have been recoverable, but Danny panicked, pulled too hard on the stick, went into an unrecoverable spin. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. He was 22 years old. His parents drove 8 hours to watch him graduate flight school 6 months earlier. Isabella set down her coffee cup, her hands suddenly unsteady. Command said it was pilot error. Mechanical failure complicated by inexperience. No fault assigned to flight leadership. Jake looked up at her, and she saw her own haunted expression reflected in his eyes. But I knew better. If I'd pulled him from the formation when my instincts told me to, Danny would be alive. The operations center continued its buzz of activity around them, but Isabella felt like they were sitting in a bubble of shared understanding. So I requested transfer to transport, Jake continued. Told myself it was because I wanted to serve differently, help in a new way. But the truth? I was terrified of making another command decision that might get someone killed. Isabella stared at him, seeing herself in his story with uncomfortable clarity. 23 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Jake's mouth curved in a bitter smile. Not that I'm counting. But you're still flying. Transport isn't the same thing. Follow flight plans, navigate weather, manage systems. Most of the time, the biggest decision I make is whether to request a different altitude for passenger comfort. Jake paused. Until today. Isabella felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of kinship she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Here was someone who understood the weight of command, the cost of leadership, the way guilt could follow you even when logic said you'd done nothing wrong. Today was the first time since Danny died that I had to make the kind of decision that could get people killed, Jake said. Whether to try for Portland or divert to Hillsborough, whether to trust a legendary pilot I'd just met or stick with standard procedures. You made the right choices, Isabella said automatically. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Did I? Or did I just get lucky? What if you'd been wrong about the approach? What if trusting you had gotten everyone killed? Isabella found herself leaning forward, drawn by the raw honesty in his voice. But it didn't. We brought everyone home. This time, Jake said. Just like you brought those Marines home. But the guilt doesn't care about success, does it? It just keeps asking what if. Isabella felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. For 3 years, she'd carried the weight of her choices alone, convinced that no one could understand the complexity of survivors' guilt mixed with command responsibility. But Jake understood. He carried his own version of the same burden. The nightmares are the worst part, she said quietly. Jake nodded. I dream about Danny sometimes. In the dreams, I make different choices. Pull him from formation, ground him for additional training, anything except let him fly that day. I dream about Rodriguez's daughter, Isabella whispered. She's always asking me why I let her daddy die, and I never have a good answer. They sat in silence for a long moment, two pilots bound together by the shared understanding of what it meant to carry responsibility for other people's lives. "Can I tell you something?" Jake said finally. "Something that might sound crazy?" Isabella nodded. "Today, working with you in that cockpit, it was the first time in almost 2 years that I felt like a pilot again. Not a transport operator, not a guy hiding from responsibility, but a real pilot, part of a crew, making decisions that mattered, trusting and being trusted." Isabella felt warmth spread through her chest, an emotion she hadn't experienced in so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "It felt good," she admitted. "Scary as hell, but good. You were incredible up there. The way you read the aircraft, the way you worked with our limitations instead of fighting them. That's not something you learn, that's instinct. That's who you are." Isabella shook her head. "I'm nobody. I've spent 3 years being nobody." "No," Jake said firmly. "You've spent 3 years hiding from somebody. There's a difference." He reached over and gently covered her hand with his. The contact was warm, grounding, unexpectedly comforting. "Isabella, I know we just met. I know this is crazy timing and impossible circumstances, but I haven't felt this connected to another person in years. Not romantically. I mean, not just romantically. As a human being, as someone who understands." Isabella looked down at their joined hands, feeling something she'd thought was dead stirring back to life. Not just attraction, though she was beginning to realize that Jake Torres was an extraordinarily good-looking man. Something deeper. Recognition. Understanding. The possibility that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. "I live in San Diego," she said quietly. "I'm based in Norfolk," Jake replied. "But I'm requesting transfer to the West Coast. Been thinking about it for months." Isabella felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth, the first genuine smile she'd worn in longer than she could remember. "That's a big change." "I'm good with big changes. Today taught me that maybe it's time to stop hiding from the things that scare me." Isabella looked up at him, seeing not just the attractive pilot who'd trusted her with his aircraft and his passengers' lives, but someone who might understand the weight she carried, someone who might help her carry it. "Jake," she said carefully, "I don't know how to do this, how to be around people again, how to let anyone close enough to matter." "Neither do I," Jake admitted. "But maybe we can figure it out together." Outside the operations center windows, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Emergency vehicles were returning to their stations, passengers were reuniting with worried families, and normal airport operations were slowly resuming. Inside, 2 damaged pilots sat holding hands and discovering that sometimes the most important rescues happened not in the sky, but on the ground, when 2 people found the courage to save each other from the prisons of their own making. For the first time in 3 years, Isabella Chen felt like she might be ready to stop being a ghost. And for the first time in almost 2 years, Jake Torres felt like he might be ready to trust himself with another person's heart. The hotel room phone rang at 6:47 a.m., shattering the fragile peace Isabella had managed to find in sleep. She'd been dreaming of flying again, not the nightmares that usually plagued her, but the weightless freedom she'd once loved. The harsh electronic ring dragged her back to reality with brutal efficiency. "Hello," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Isabella Chen?" The voice was crisp, professional, unfamiliar. Isabella sat up, instantly alert. 3 years of hiding had taught her to be wary of unexpected calls. "Who is this?" "Captain Rebecca Shaw." FAA Flight Standards District Office. We need to speak with you regarding yesterday's incident. Isabella's blood ran cold. She'd given her statement, answered their technical questions, provided her perspective on the emergency procedures. What more could they want? I already spoke with investigators yesterday, she said carefully. New information has come to light. We'll need you to come in this morning for additional questioning. Isabella checked the clock. Jake was supposed to pick her up at 8. They'd made plans for breakfast, a tentative first step toward whatever was building between them. She'd been looking forward to it with an anticipation that scared and thrilled her in equal measure. "What kind of new information?" she asked. "I'd rather discuss this in person. Can you be here by 9? Isabella closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of dread settling on her shoulders. "I'll be there." The FAA office was sterile and impersonal. All beige walls and fluorescent lighting that made everything look washed out and vaguely threatening. Isabella sat across from Captain Shaw, a severe woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen every type of aviation incident and wasn't impressed by any of them. "Miss Chen," Shaw began, consulting a thick file, "you represented yourself yesterday as Lieutenant Commander Isabella Chen, call sign Ghost, formerly of the U.S. Navy." "That's correct. But you failed to mention that you've been medically disqualified from flight duty." Isabella felt the floor drop out from under her. "What?" Shaw slid a document across the table. Isabella recognized it immediately, her medical records from the Navy, including the psychological evaluation that had led to her early discharge. The evaluation she'd thought was confidential. The evaluation that detailed her PTSD diagnosis, her survivor's guilt, her complete psychological breakdown after the Marine extraction mission. According to these records, you were found mentally unfit for flight duty following a psychological evaluation conducted after your final mission. You were granted honorable discharge with full disability benefits due to service-related psychological trauma. Isabella stared at the papers, feeling exposed and violated. When someone without current medical clearance takes control of a commercial aircraft, we tend to investigate thoroughly. Shaw's voice was matter-of-fact, but there was disapproval underneath. Your actions yesterday put 147 passengers at risk. My actions saved 147 passengers, Isabella said, anger flaring. Your own investigators confirmed that the emergency landing was successful because you violated federal aviation regulations by operating an aircraft without proper certification or medical clearance. Shaw interrupted. "Miss Chen, I understand you have an impressive service record, but the fact remains that you were deemed psychologically unfit to fly." Isabella felt the walls closing in around her. 3 years of carefully constructed anonymity, shattered. 3 years of avoiding exactly this kind of scrutiny, wasted. The psychological evaluation was, Isabella struggled for words. "I was grieving. I just lost 6 pilots under my command. Anyone would have." Would have what? Suffered a complete nervous breakdown during debriefing? Refused medical treatment? Disappeared from your assigned duty station for 72 hours? Each word hit Isabella like a physical blow. She remembered those 3 days wandering through a foreign city in a fugue state, unable to eat or sleep, replaying the mission over and over in her mind. She'd been found by military police in a hotel room, catatonic with grief and guilt. "That was 3 years ago," Isabella said weakly. "I'm not the same person. According to your medical records, you never completed the recommended psychological treatment. You refused counseling, refused medication, and requested immediate discharge rather than accept help." Shaw leaned forward. "Tell me, Miss Chen, what qualified you to determine that you were mentally fit to fly yesterday?" Isabella opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she say? That she'd felt ready? that the crisis had called to something inside her that felt familiar and right, that for the first time in 3 years she'd felt like herself again. "Commander Torres is here," Shaw said, checking her watch. "We've asked him to join us for this portion of the interview." Isabella's heart stopped. "Jake? Why?" "Because according to the cockpit voice recorder, Commander Torres relinquished control of the aircraft to you, despite knowing you weren't qualified to fly. We need to understand why he made that decision." The door opened, and Jake walked in. Isabella could see immediately that something had changed. His face was carefully neutral, professionally composed in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of her own emotional walls. "Commander Torres," Shaw said, "thank you for joining us. Please, have a seat." Jake sat down without looking at Isabella. That small detail, the way he avoided her eyes, sent a chill through her chest. "Commander, yesterday you allowed an unqualified civilian to take control of your aircraft during an emergency. Can you explain your reasoning?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "I believed that Lieutenant Commander Chen's experience would be valuable in managing the emergency." "But you were aware that she hadn't flown in 3 years?" "She mentioned that, yes." "Were you aware that she'd been medically disqualified from flight duty due to psychological unfitness?" Isabella watched Jake's face, saw the moment the words hit him. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hands, resting on the table, curled slightly. "No," he said quietly. "I was not aware of that." Shaw nodded. "According to these records, Miss Chen suffered what the Navy termed a severe psychological break following her final mission. She was diagnosed with PTSD, survivor's guilt, and what the examining psychiatrist called command-related trauma syndrome." Isabella felt each word like a knife. She could see Jake processing the information, could practically watch him reassessing everything about their interaction, everything about her. The psychiatrist's report states that Miss Chen was emotionally volatile, prone to flashbacks, and demonstrated severely impaired judgment regarding risk assessment. Shaw's voice was relentless. It specifically recommended that she never be allowed to return to flight duty. "That's enough," Isabella said, her voice cracking. "You've made your point." But Shaw wasn't finished. The report also indicates that Miss Chen became fixated on the idea that she was personally responsible for her squadron's deaths, despite evidence to the contrary. It describes her as unable to accept the reality of wartime losses and potentially dangerous to herself and others in high-stress situations. Isabella felt something break inside her chest. She looked at Jake, desperate to see some sign of the understanding they'd shared the night before, some recognition of the connection that had felt so real and precious. Instead, she saw doubt, concern, the careful distance of a professional pilot realizing he'd made a serious error in judgment. "Jake," she said quietly, "yesterday in the cockpit." "Yesterday," Jake interrupted, his voice formal and controlled, "I made a decision based on incomplete information. If I'd known about your medical disqualification, I would never have allowed you to take the controls." The words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She felt the fragile hope she'd been nurturing since yesterday crumble into dust. "But we saved everyone," she whispered. This time, Jake said, echoing his own words from the night before, but with a completely different meaning. "But what about next time? What if your condition had caused you to freeze up or panic or make the wrong decision?" Your condition, as if she were a piece of broken equipment instead of a human being. Isabella stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I think we're done here." "Miss Chen," Shaw said, "we still have questions." "I'm sure you do, but I don't have any more answers." Isabella looked at Jake one more time, hoping to see some crack in his professional facade, some sign that the man who'd held her hand and shared his own guilt was still there. Instead, she saw a stranger, a pilot who'd made a mistake and was now trying to distance himself from it. "For what it's worth," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the pain crushing her chest. "Yesterday was the first time in 3 years I felt like I might be worth saving. Thank you for reminding me why I stopped trying." She walked toward the door, then stopped without turning around. "Commander Torres, when you write your report, make sure to note that the psychologically unfit civilian you allowed to fly your aircraft brought it down safely with 0 casualties. I'd hate for that detail to get lost in all the medical jargon." Isabella left the room without looking back, but she could feel Jake's eyes following her. Part of her hoped he would call her name, would remember the connection they'd shared, would choose her over his career concerns. But he didn't. And as the door closed behind her, Isabella realized she was right back where she'd started 3 years ago, alone, damaged, and convinced that some people were meant to carry their burdens in isolation. The difference was, this time it hurt worse. Because this time, she'd allowed herself to hope. Isabella sat in the rental car in the airport parking lot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her flight back to San Diego didn't leave for 3 hours, but she couldn't bring herself to start the engine and drive away. Through the windshield, she could see planes taking off and landing with mechanical precision, their movements as choreographed and predictable as a ballet she'd once been part of. The sight should have brought pain, as it had for 3 years. Instead, she felt empty. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister. "Flight tracker shows delays in Portland. Everything okay?" Isabella stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Everything's fine. See you tonight." But nothing was fine. She'd spent the morning being systematically dismantled by bureaucrats who reduced her entire identity to a psychiatric diagnosis, her entire worth to a series of checkbox failures. Worse, she'd watched Jake, the first person in 3 years who'd seemed to understand her, retreat behind professional distance and doubt. "What did you expect?" she asked herself. "That someone would look past the broken parts and see something worth saving?" Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. "Isabella, it's Jake. Can we talk, please?" Isabella stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of her wanted to ignore it, to protect herself from further humiliation. Part of her wanted to text back something cutting and final, to end this before it could hurt her any more than it already had. Instead, she found herself typing, "I'm at the airport, leaving in a few hours." The response came immediately, "Which terminal? I'm coming to you." Isabella closed her eyes. She was making another mistake, opening herself up to more pain. But something in his urgency, in the fact that he was willing to chase her down, made her answer, "Terminal B, long-term parking, level 3. She sat back to wait, trying to prepare herself for whatever was coming. An apology, maybe. An explanation. More questions about her mental health, her fitness, her worthiness to be trusted with anything important. 20 minutes later, she saw Jake's car pull into the parking structure. He found her quickly, parking 2 spaces away and walking over with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he'd been thinking hard about this conversation. Isabella rolled down her window but didn't get out. "Hi," Jake said, approaching cautiously. Isabella's voice was flat, emotionless. "Can I?" He gestured toward the passenger seat. "Can I sit with you for a few minutes?" Isabella considered saying no. It would be easier, cleaner, but she nodded toward the passenger door. Jake climbed in, and immediately the small space felt charged with tension. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring through the windshield at the planes in the distance. "I screwed up," Jake said finally. "Which part? Letting the crazy person fly your plane, or treating her like a stranger when you found out she was officially crazy?" Jake flinched. "Don't call yourself that." "Why not? It's what's in my file," psychologically unfit, emotionally volatile, potentially dangerous. Isabella's voice was bitter. All true, apparently. No, Jake said firmly. It's not. Isabella turned to look at him directly for the first time since he'd gotten in the car. Isn't it? You seemed to think so this morning. Jake ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as his tell when he was struggling with something difficult. This morning I panicked, he admitted. Shaw started reading from your file, talking about psychological breaks and impaired judgment, and all I could think about was Danny Reeves. Your student pilot? Yeah. And suddenly, I was terrified that I'd made the same mistake again, trusted someone I shouldn't have trusted, put people at risk because I was thinking with my heart instead of my head. Isabella felt a flicker of something that might have been understanding, but it was quickly smothered by hurt. So you decided I was the mistake. For about 4 hours, yeah. Jake turned to face her, until I realized I was being an idiot. What changed your mind? Jake was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was careful but determined. I went back to the airport and watched the cockpit voice recorder footage. All of it, not just the parts Shaw played for us. Isabella's stomach clenched. She'd forgotten about the cameras in the cockpit, the way every word and gesture would be preserved for analysis. What did you see? I saw someone who was scared but functioning, someone who made sound decisions under pressure, someone who worked seamlessly with a crew she'd just met, who put passengers' lives ahead of her own comfort, who flew a damaged aircraft with more skill than I've ever seen. Jake paused, then continued. But more than that, I saw someone fighting her own demons every second, but doing it anyway. Someone who could have hidden in her seat and let us crash, but chose to help instead. Isabella felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. The file says you had a breakdown 3 years ago after losing 6 people under your command. The file doesn't say anything about who you are now, what you're capable of now, or what you mean to me now. The last words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Isabella wasn't sure she was ready to handle. Jake, she said carefully, you've known me for 2 days. You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? Jake shifted in his seat to face her more directly. Isabella, I've been sleepwalking through my life for almost 2 years. Going through the motions, keeping my head down, avoiding anything that mattered because I was afraid of making another mistake that would get someone hurt. He reached over and gently took her hand, the same gesture that had felt so comforting the night before. Yesterday, working with you, I felt alive for the first time since Danny died. Not because of the emergency or the adrenaline, but because I was working with someone who understood. Someone who knew what it meant to carry responsibility and live with the consequences. Isabella looked down at their joined hands. Someone who's broken. Someone who's been broken and is still fighting. There's a difference. Isabella felt something crack inside her chest, but this time it didn't feel like breaking. It felt like something that had been frozen beginning to thaw. This morning, Jake continued, when Shaw was reading from your file, all I could think about was protecting myself, distancing myself from another potential mistake. But driving here, I realized something. What? I don't want to be protected from you. I want to be with you. Whatever that looks like, whatever it costs, whatever risks it involves. Isabella studied his face, looking for signs of doubt or uncertainty. Instead, she saw the same steady determination he'd shown in the cockpit, the same willingness to make difficult decisions under pressure. Jake, I come with a lot of baggage. Nightmares, guilt, 3 years of isolation. I don't even know how to be around people anymore, let alone how to be in a relationship. Then we'll figure it out together, Jake said simply. Look, I don't know what this is between us. I don't know if it's love or recognition or just 2 damaged people finding each other. But I know I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to choose you over my fears." Isabella felt the tears she'd been fighting finally spill over. But for the first time in 3 years, they weren't tears of pain or grief. They were tears of relief, of recognition, of the overwhelming possibility that she might not have to carry her burdens alone anymore. "What about your career?" she asked. "The investigation, the questions about your judgment?" Jake shrugged. "I'll deal with it. Transfer to civilian flying if I have to. The Navy's been good to me, but it's not the only thing I am. And if I have another breakdown, if the nightmares come back, if I can't handle being close to someone, then we'll handle it together," Jake said. "Isabella, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be real, to be yourself, whatever that looks like." Isabella looked out at the planes again, but this time she saw possibility instead of loss. She saw a future that might include flying again, laughing again, trusting again. She saw a future that might include love. "I live in San Diego," she said, echoing their conversation from the night before. "I meant what I said about requesting a transfer," Jake replied. "I hear the weather's better on the West Coast anyway." Isabella turned to look at him, seeing not the professional pilot who doubted her that morning, but the man who'd been brave enough to chase her down and fight for something worth fighting for. "Jake," she said quietly, "I'm terrified." "So am I," he admitted. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe the best things in life are supposed to be a little scary." Isabella thought about yesterday's emergency landing, about the moment she'd chosen to walk into the cockpit instead of hiding in her seat, about the choice to risk everything for the possibility of saving lives, of mattering, of being more than just a ghost haunting her own existence. Maybe this was the same kind of choice. Maybe love was just another form of flying, terrifying and wonderful and requiring the same kind of trust in things you couldn't control. "Okay," she said, so quietly Jake had to lean closer to hear her. "Okay? Okay, let's figure it out together. Whatever this is, whatever it becomes." Isabella squeezed his hand. "But I can't promise it will be easy." Jake smiled, and Isabella realized it was the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since they'd met. "Easy is overrated. I'm more interested in real." Outside the car, planes continued their endless dance of takeoff and landing, carrying people toward destinations unknown. Inside the car, 2 pilots who had lost their way began the slow, careful process of finding each other. It wasn't a guarantee. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was just 2 people choosing to be brave enough to try. And for Isabella Chen, who had spent 3 years convinced she didn't deserve a second chance, that felt like a miracle. Have you ever had to choose between playing it safe and taking a risk on something that could change your life? Sometimes the scariest decisions are the ones that lead to the most beautiful outcomes. What do you think? Is it worth risking heartbreak for the possibility of real love? Share your thoughts in the comment below. 6 months later, the small airfield outside San Diego was quiet in the early morning light, the kind of peaceful stillness that only existed before the world fully woke up. Isabella stood beside the Cessna 172, her hands running along the aircraft's wing with the reverence of someone greeting an old friend. "Second thoughts." Jake's voice came from behind her, warm with understanding rather than concern. Isabella turned to find him approaching with 2 cups of coffee and the flight plan they'd filed together. He'd kept his promise about the transfer, trading his Navy transport position for a civilian job with a regional airline based out of San Diego. The adjustment had been easier than expected. Apparently, good pilots were welcome anywhere. "No second thoughts," Isabella said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Just remembering." It had taken 4 months of therapy, careful conversations, and patient rebuilding before Isabella had felt ready to even sit in a cockpit again. The nightmares had come back at first, triggered by the familiar smell of aviation fuel and the sound of engines spinning up. But this time, she hadn't faced them alone. Jake had been there for the bad nights, holding her when she woke up gasping about Rodriguez's daughter and William's retirement plans. He'd been there for the good days too, celebrating small victories like the first time she'd completed a pre-flight inspection without her hands shaking. Dr. Martinez, the therapist Jake had helped her find, had been blunt about the process. Healing isn't linear and it isn't quick, but it is possible if you're willing to do the work. Isabella had been willing. More than that, she'd been determined, not just to fly again, but to live again, to be more than the sum of her worst moments. "You know," Jake said, settling beside her against the wing, "I never asked you something." "What's that?" "Why this plane? Why a Cessna for your first flight back instead of something with more authority?" Isabella smiled, the expression coming easier now after months of practice. "Because Rodriguez learned to fly in a 172, it was the first plane he ever soloed in." She'd told Jake about her squadron gradually, sharing memories as they surfaced, not just the mission that had killed them, but the people they'd been. Rodriguez's terrible singing voice during long flights, Murphy's collection of bad aviation jokes, William's dream of buying a boat and sailing around the world with his wife. "I thought maybe if I could fly his kind of plane without falling apart, it would be like making peace with his memory, proving that remembering them doesn't have to be only about how they died." Jake nodded, understanding immediately. It was one of the things she'd come to love about him, the way he could follow her thoughts even when they took complicated turns through grief and guilt and hope. "Ready for your co-pilot briefing?" Isabella asked, pulling out the checklist. "You're the pilot in command today," Jake said with mock formality. "I'm just along for the ride." It was a small thing, but it mattered. Isabella's medical certificate had been reinstated 2 months ago after extensive evaluation and Dr. Martinez's professional recommendation. The FAA had been thorough but fair, more interested in her current mental health than her past breakdown. Captain Shaw had even called to personally approve her return to flight status. "Miss Chen," she'd said, "I may have been harsh in my initial assessment, but I want you to know that your actions that day, regardless of the regulatory complications, were exemplary. The aviation community is better with pilots like you in the sky." Isabella began the pre-flight inspection, her hands moving with increasing confidence through the familiar routine. 6 months ago, she'd been hiding in seat 8A, convinced she'd never fly again. Now she was preparing to take command of an aircraft for the first time in 3 years. "Control surfaces free and clear," she called out, testing the ailerons. "Looking good from here," Jake responded, playing his role as safety observer with the kind of professional competence that still made her heart skip slightly. They'd moved in together 3 months ago, a decision that had terrified Isabella more than her first solo flight as a teenager. Sharing space, sharing daily routines, sharing the mundane intimacies of life, it had felt more vulnerable than any emergency landing. But Jake had made it work through patience and understanding, giving her space when she needed it and closeness when she was ready for it. He'd learned to recognize her tells, the way she got quiet when the nightmares were building, the way she cleaned obsessively when anxiety was winning, the way she touched his hand when she needed grounding. In return, Isabella had learned Jake's patterns, how he got restless when he hadn't flown in too long, how he made terrible jokes when he was nervous, how he still woke up sometimes calling Danny's name. They'd both had bad days. Days when the weight of their respective guilt felt too heavy to carry, but they'd learned to carry it together, to remind each other that surviving didn't make them guilty of anything except being human. Engine oil, within normal limits, Isabella continued her checklist, finding comfort in the methodical routine. "Copy that," Jake replied, then added quietly, "You know I'm proud of you, right?" Isabella paused in her inspection, looking across the aircraft at him. For what? For being here, for fighting your way back, for trusting me enough to let me be part of it. Isabella felt the familiar warmth that had become associated with Jake's presence in her life, not the desperate need of someone drowning, but the quiet contentment of someone who'd found solid ground. I couldn't have done it alone, she said honestly. You shouldn't have had to, Jake replied. That's what people are for, sharing the load, making the hard things easier. They finished the pre-flight in companionable silence, their movements synchronized through months of flying together. Isabella had started with short local flights, building confidence and muscle memory. Jake had been there for all of them, sometimes as co-pilot, sometimes as passenger, always as the steady presence that reminded her she wasn't alone in the sky. San Diego Tower, Cessna 879 Charlie, requesting taxi for takeoff. Isabella spoke into her headset as they settled into the cockpit. 9 Charlie, San Diego Tower, taxi to runway 9, wind calm, altimeter 3015. Isabella's hands moved across the familiar controls, starting the engine and beginning their taxi to the active runway. Through the windscreen, she could see the Pacific Ocean stretching endlessly blue under the morning sun. You know, Jake said as they approached the runway, 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in a Cessna with the woman of my dreams, preparing for a flight along the coast, I'd have said they were crazy. The woman of your dreams? Isabella raised an eyebrow. That's setting the bar pretty high. Not high enough, Jake said simply, and the sincerity in his voice made Isabella's chest tight with emotion. 9 Charlie, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 9, came the tower's voice. Isabella aligned the aircraft with the runway centerline, her hands steady on the controls. For a moment, she thought about the last time she'd been pilot in command, 3 years ago, flying a damaged fighter through hostile skies with her squadron burning around her. This was different. This was choosing to fly, not because lives depended on it, but because flying was part of who she was, part of who she'd always been, underneath the grief and guilt and fear. Ready? She asked Jake. Ready, he confirmed. Isabella advanced the throttle, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as the aircraft gathered speed. The rumble of tires on asphalt, the increasing lightness as the wings began to generate lift, the magical moment when the earth fell away beneath them. They lifted off smoothly, climbing into the clear California sky. Below them, San Diego spread out in familiar patterns, the harbor where Jake's new airline was based, the neighborhood where they'd found their apartment, the beach where they walked most evenings after work. Left turn to heading 270, Isabella announced, banking gently toward the coast. As they leveled off at 3,000 feet, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years: pure joy in flight. Not the desperate adrenaline of emergency flying, not the grim satisfaction of a mission completed, but the simple pleasure of being aloft with someone she loved, in an aircraft that responded to her touch like a part of her own body. Isabella, Jake said softly. Yeah? Look at your hands. Isabella glanced down and realized she was flying with the same relaxed confidence she'd once possessed before grief and guilt had taught her to second-guess every decision. Her hands were steady on the controls, her movements precise but unhurried. I feel like me again, she said, wonder in her voice. You are you again, Jake replied. Maybe a different version than before, but still you. They flew south along the coastline, past beaches dotted with early morning surfers and joggers. Isabella found herself thinking not about the pilots she'd lost, but about the ones she'd known, their love of flying, their dedication to the mission, their belief in the importance of what they did. Maybe that was the real way to honor their memory, not by grounding herself in guilt, but by flying again. By choosing to be part of something larger than her own pain. "Jake," she said, as they approached the turning point of their planned route, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "The regional airline you work for, are they hiring pilots?" Jake turned to look at her, surprise and hope mingling on his face. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Isabella banked into a gentle right turn, beginning their return to San Diego. "I'm saying maybe it's time to stop hiding from who I am. Maybe it's time to fly commercially again, to be part of a crew, to do the job I was trained to do." "Isabella," Jake's voice was thick with emotion. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure I want to try," Isabella said. "I'm sure I don't want to spend the rest of my life being afraid of my own abilities. And I'm sure that if I'm going to do this, I want to do it with you." Jake reached over and covered her hand on the control yoke, a gesture that had become their shorthand for connection, support, understanding. "Together," he said simply. "Together," Isabella agreed. They flew the rest of the route in comfortable silence. Two pilots sharing the sky and the future spreading out before them like the endless blue of the Pacific. When they contacted the tower for landing clearance, Isabella's voice was steady and confident. "San Diego Tower, Cessna 9 Charlie, requesting full-stop landing." 9 Charlie, San Diego Tower, cleared to land runway 9, wind calm. As Isabella brought the aircraft in for landing, she thought about the circle she'd traveled, from the accomplished pilot she'd been, through the broken person she'd become, to this new version of herself that incorporated both triumph and loss, both confidence and vulnerability. The touchdown was smooth, professional, the kind of landing that made flying look effortless. As they taxied back to the ramp, Isabella realized she was smiling, not the careful, practiced expression she'd worn for months, but a real smile of genuine happiness. "So," Jake said, as they completed their shutdown checklist, "what do you think? Ready to make this a regular thing?" Isabella looked out at the airfield, at the planes preparing for departure and arrival, at the endless dance of aviation that had been her first love and might be again. "Yeah," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I think I am." They climbed out of the aircraft together, and as they walked across the tarmac toward the terminal, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years, the excited anticipation of a future full of possibilities. Behind them, the Cessna sat quietly on the ramp, engine ticking as it cooled in the morning sun. It was just a training aircraft, nothing special or heroic about it. But for Isabella, it represented something profound, the choice to try again, to trust again, to fly again, to live again. Jake took her hand as they reached his car, the gesture as natural as breathing. Isabella looked back at the airfield one more time, then at the man beside her who had helped her find her way back to herself. "Now we go home," she said. "And tomorrow we figure out how to fly together for the rest of our lives." It wasn't the ending Isabella had expected when she'd boarded that commercial flight 6 months ago as a passenger in seat 8. It wasn't the fairy tale resolution where all pain disappeared and all questions were answered. But it was real. It was hers. And for the first time in 3 years, Isabella Chen, pilot, survivor, and woman learning to love again, was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes the most beautiful journeys are the ones that take us back to who we were always meant to be. Isabella found her way back to the sky and to love, proving that it's never too late for a second chance. What dreams have you put aside that might be waiting for you to find the courage to try again? Share your story below. You never know who might need to hear that comeback stories are always possible. In the distance, another aircraft lifted off into the blue California sky, carrying passengers toward destinations unknown, piloted by crew members who understood that flying wasn't just about getting from one place to another, it was about the courage to leave the ground and trust in the possibility of safe landing. Just like love, just like life, just like the choice to try again.
What do you think of this complete emotional journey? Isabella's transformation from a broken war hero hiding in seat 8A to a woman ready to fly and love again, finding her perfect match in Jake, who understood both her pain and her strength. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.